Anna, thank you so much. What a nice introduction. How sweet. I am a sensitive guy, so no tough questions, irrespective of the fact that I have just flown in. And I've known to get angry as well. So you're glad I'm up here on the stage. So anyway, I'm really delighted to be here, and it's a real honor to be asked to come and to present to you today. I didn't hesitate to come. My first time actually in Stockholm, in Sweden. So thank you for having me. I appreciate very much the warm welcome. And I just want to say thank you to all of you for what you do, because I know you're here because you care about addiction. You would not be here taking time out of your day and the expense, etc. So thank you for all your efforts every day for helping people suffering from addiction. I think we're all on the same page there. We may have different ideas, philosophies, ways of helping people, but the ultimate goal is to help people and families who suffer from this very pervasive, high-burden, high-volume disease in most middle and high-income countries. So what I want to do today is, over the next 45 minutes or so, is talk to you a little bit about what we've learned in the last 25 years, really, in terms of our understanding about addiction and addiction recovery. By the way, all of these slides will be available. You can have the slides after the talk, so you don't need to scribble things down. And you can always email me if you have questions. I can send you papers and so on regarding the data, some of the data that I present. I'm going to talk a little bit about the neuroscience, what we've learned from a neuroscientific perspective, and also how that relates to our understanding of recovery, long-term remission and long-term recovery, and how we get there from here. So as Anna kindly mentioned, this is a Recovery Research Institute, started in 2012. She mentioned already the purpose of it really is to translate, synthesize, summarize, and disseminate our science on addiction treatment and recovery for the benefit of the public good. So we conduct novel investigations as well as translating existing research. You can sign up for we have a free bulletin at recoveryanswers.org if you want to sign up and get that every month. It's free of charge. We are donor funded, so we don't take money from industry. So moving on to what we're learning about addiction as a chronic illness. So this schematic really kind of highlights the timeline of people who have the more severe complex forms of addiction. So when we look in the population, we see a broad spectrum, a highly variable and heterogeneous mix of people who meet criteria for a substance use disorder. But not all of them are the same, right? We have a high degree of variability in terms of the complexity, severity, chronicity, impact. But the kinds of folks that we see in treatment, typically, the roughly 10 to 20% we see in treatment each year in specialty settings, tend to have a chronic course. And this is generally what it looks like. And it tends to be a long one. So we know that it takes about 4 to 5 years after the onset of a substance use disorder before people start to seek help for that disorder. Now, why is that? Of course, part of the reason is because of the stigma and shame and discrimination that people experience as a result of having a substance use disorder. So people try to hide it. They try to navigate as best they can, do their best to control it. So it takes about 4 to 5 years before they give up on that, or the criminal justice system feels that they should give up on that and seek help. What's also noteworthy is after people seek help, some kind of specialty treatment or mutual help involvement, it takes about 8 years and about 4 to 5 treatment episodes to get 1 year of full sustained remission. That's 12 months without any symptoms, okay? Roughly 8 years on average to get 1 year of full sustained remission. Now, the good news is during that 8-year period, most of those days are abstinent days. It's just that people may get 3 months and have a relapse, may get 6 months, have a relapse, get 9 months. So they're making progress all during that time, and most of those days are abstinent days. But to get 12 months in a row without symptoms, in other words, full sustained remission, takes people on average, again, on average, about 8 years. I think what's also very important from this diagram is that after people achieve 1 year of full sustained remission, it takes on average 4 to 5 years of continuous remission before the risk of relapse or the risk of meeting criteria for a substance use disorder in the following year drops below 15%. Why 15%? Because 15% is the annual risk in the general population of meeting criteria for a substance use disorder. So to be no more likely than anybody else out there meeting criteria for a substance use disorder in the next year, if you've already had it, takes 4 to 5 years of continuous remission. So what does that suggest? It suggests that this is a chronic illness, it's susceptible to relapse. It takes people a while to get into remission, but to stay in remission, we know about a third of people roughly will become symptomatic who have a year in the next 2 years, next 2 to 3 years, about 1/3. The good news is that it's a good prognosis disorder. The substance use disorder is actually a good prognosis disorder. 60+ % of people achieve full sustained remission and long-term recovery, but it can take a while to get there. So when we talk to clinicians and frontline primary care docs who feel hopeless, they're giving up, they don't want to bother with people who are addicted, I think we should emphasize that this is a long haul. We can plant seeds. We can destabilize emerging addiction patterns by asking questions, beginning a conversation. Early, the better. The earlier, the better. The earlier we start this conversation with individuals that we come into contact with clinically and in other settings, the shorter the time to remission. That's the other good news. Now, we know this is a chronic illness, but we've tended to still have an acute care mindset. And when we think about addiction treatment, we think about other chronic illnesses like hypertension, for example, and the way that treatments for hypertension are approved and evaluated, we have addiction treatment actually has a different standard. And here's an example. The Federal Drug Administration in the United States approves different medications for various conditions, as well as devices. But here's proof of hypertension, a medication, for example, or a treatment for hypertension working. The patient, so hypertension is in the light blue. So patient, prior to coming into treatment, their blood pressure is high. You give them the treatment, it goes down, that's good. And then when you take away the treatment, blood pressure goes up. That's proof that the medication is actually working. Okay. Now let's apply that same logic to addiction. People come in, highly symptomatic, give them the treatment, symptoms go away or go down, they get into abstinence, remission, take away the treatment, and the symptoms return. That's proof that treatment does not work for addiction, right? How come? We're being held to a different standard here, and it's in part we've got ourselves to blame because we're thinking or we're giving the impression that a 30-day period in treatment is going to be the answer, okay? It's like we're going to somehow shoot someone out of a cannon and they're going to zoom out of that cannon and we're going to shoot them far enough after this huge, massive, intensive effort that they don't need anything else and they're going to go into orbit and circle and get into recovery and stay there. But we know with chronic illnesses and what we see, as I just showed you, is that really what we need is some kind of continuing recovery monitoring and recovery management. In fact, we've tended to view, I like this analogy of a burning building because we've become expert at putting the fire out. Brilliant. We've got great medications for stabilizing people. We know how to get people stabilized, off of alcohol, other drugs. But we haven't been very focused or very good at preventing the fire from restarting. And part of the reason, I think, is that we failed in our architectural planning. We failed in the architectural planning and also providing the building materials for that building to be rebuilt. Not only that, but we haven't even given people the rebuilding permits to be able to rebuild their lives. Right? I assume you have to get a permit to build something in Stockholm, in Sweden, yeah? You have to get it approved. You can't just go and build something, right? But when people have a criminal record, usually related to their drug and alcohol use, they often can't get a housing loan, they can't get an education loan, they can't go to college, they can't get their foot in the door of real life because they can't get over those laws and get those rebuilding permits necessary. Now, we've learned a lot, like I said, in the last 25 years in our understanding of how addiction affects the brain. And we describe addiction these days, many people do, as a disease of the brain, a genetically influenced disease of the brain that affects these neurocircuits of reward, memory, motivation, impulse control, and judgment. And we know these circuits are dramatically and radically impaired as a function of exposure. The more exposure, it's typically in a dose-response fashion. The chronicity and intensity of use and exposure, the more these neurocircuits are impaired. Not just functionally, but also structurally. We have known for a longer time from autopsy studies before imaging came along that the brains, for example, of alcohol-addicted persons were dramatically changed. In fact, on autopsy, when you look at the brains of people who have become alcohol addicted in a severe way, their brains weigh about 1/3 less of age and gender-matched counterparts. Now, you don't have to look very long or very hard. Here's someone with alcohol addiction. Here's someone who's a moderate drinker. And I know, as a trained scientist, that this hole is bigger than this one over here. But the thing is here is that, you don't have to look long or hard to understand, and I could show you functional images of the same kinds of things from a functional perspective. These are structural ones, which are quite dramatic. But it helps us to explain what we observe, maybe as a family member of someone who's in our family who's addicted, or in our patients who we scratch our head and say, wait a minute, why does this person keep on doing this over and over again? They don't want to, they're struggling, they seem to be using against their own will. And when we see the functional and structural damage that has occurred, it helps us understand a little bit more clearly how an organism with a propensity for life, for roughly 80 years of life, self-destructs, poisons itself to death, roughly 30 years prior to its normal expiration date. There is a medical malfunction that goes on in the brain. And this is something that I don't think we fully appreciate, that I think we're beginning to appreciate more with the findings from neuroscience. The other thing from neuroendocrine studies and neurotransmitter neuroendocrine studies is that the effort involved in getting and staying in recovery is immense, right? We know that changing any behavior is hard, but imagine if your brain is so damaged that, and your central nervous system is so damaged, and trying to make those changes with that on board. We know, for example, both stress is elevated, stress hormones, corticotropin releasing factor, cortisol, neuropeptides are elevated for months, sometimes years, in people who have had addiction problems. Not only that, not only is stress and sensitivity to stress elevated, but the propensity to perceive reward is downgraded. And this is because the reward pathway in the brain is trying to adapt. We call this neuroadaptation or tolerance. It tries to adapt to the presence of this abnormally high level of reinforcement and reward. This cascade of chemicals, particularly dopamine, which affects these dopamine D2 and D3 receptors, these receptors become downregulated as the brain and the body tries to adapt to this abnormally high signal. When you take that drug away, which is producing that abnormally high signal, of course, people experience this hedonic deafness, what we call hedonic deafness or pleasure deafness. They just can't experience normal levels of reward that they used to experience. Now, they will come to experience that level of reward because the brain recalibrates, it readjusts, upregulates. And as I'm going to show you, there are things that we can do that will accelerate that upregulation. And it may not be obvious what those things are. So, These are, just to highlight a few things, these are data from a big study we just finished in the United States. It's a nationally representative sample of the US adult population. There were 55,000 people sampled, and we asked them a question, did you once have a problem with alcohol or drugs and no longer do? And we obtained a sample of people, representative sample, roughly we know 9.1% of the US adult population is in recovery or has once had a problem with drugs or alcohol and no longer do. That's about 22.35 million people living in recovery from an alcohol or drug use disorder. And I just wanted to show you these because these are the curves related to these indices of quality of life and psychological well-being. And what we see, this is along the x-axis here, this is people from 0 up through 40 years of recovery, okay? And here is kind of more, this is standardized, but the more is better, going up the scale on the y-axis here. But you can see a general monotonic linear improvement in quality of life, happiness, self-esteem, recovery capital. There's a little bit of a turning point here. You can see it's a steeper curve here up through about 5 years, accelerates up for about 5 years, and then shallows off after about 5 years, but still increasing every year. And this is controlling for age. We know as we get older, I can see some older people looking very happy. You know, as we get older, we get happier actually, and we usually. So even controlling for that, you still see this, these improvements. And you see psychological distress, same thing, right, going down. But what's interesting is when you zoom in on these data in the first 2 years, look over here on the right-hand side. So what happens in the first 2 years? So this is up through 2 years. Here's up through this first year down here. That happiness, it starts off a little bit higher and then drops in that first year. So the self-esteem drops in the first year. Happiness drops in the first year. Psychological distress goes up a little bit in the first year, okay? So what does that tell us? It tells us when the bubble bursts and people find themselves in the reality of the situation, they actually take a psychological and emotional hit. And this makes it very difficult. We have known for a long time that this early phase of recovery, that first year, getting that 1 year of remission, is difficult. And these kind of attest to that, underscore that people are feeling worse. They start off actually in the first probably month, they're feeling pretty good. They're on a bit of a pink cloud maybe, but then reality hits them. And this is what I think we need to pay attention to early on, is this kind of reality, the bubble bursting. When reality bites, the situation hits them, they start to feel really bad about themselves. Maybe what they've done, they're looking backwards, they're looking forwards, they're seeing a hopeless landscape ahead, they see the wreckage of the past. How am I going to get out of this? And it's not the same for everybody. Again, averages can be misleading, okay, in research, but this is cutting the pie a little different. This is just looking at by primary substance. Here's quality of life and recovery capital. So if you look at opioids and stimulants, the other drug is principally stimulants, methamphetamine, cocaine. Compared to alcohol and cannabis, less stigmatized drugs. But these are the years in recovery. This is up through first 5 years. People with opioids and other drug use, stimulants, takes about 2 to 3 years to get up to the same level of quality of life that people with alcohol and cannabis have. Okay, so they're starting at a disadvantage in their quality of life. And the same in recovery capital. So recovery capital you can think of as recovery resources, social resources, work resources, educational resources, things that you can draw on to support your recovery attempt. Again, look at the difference. This is almost 1 full standard deviation. That's a big effect size, okay? So it's not everybody is the same. We need to think about primary substances. Also, in the United States, we've got different racial ethnic groups make up a large part of the population. What's interesting here is that some of the more marginalized, historically traumatized groups, Native Americans, tend to suffer seemingly regardless of how long they're in recovery. Okay? So it depends on different factors. Now, the stress I mentioned, these elevations in the stress hormones that we see in these early months and years of recovery. It's been studied. Hans Seeley was the first guy in the stress of life to really describe this idea of how physiological stress can destroy organisms, can lead to illness. You stress animals, they get sick and they die. And we didn't really understand how psychological stress could do that, but we understand more clearly now. He developed this model called the general adaptation syndrome of alarm resistance exhaustion. Think about that in terms of addiction. He wasn't studying addiction, but think about alarm resistance exhaustion in terms of addiction. What happens is, when we think about people making a quit attempt, trying to stop their drug or alcohol use, there's usually some kind of alarming event. They resist, and then become exhausted. That's exactly what he found with these animals. They resisted the stressor, became so exhausted they couldn't keep it up anymore, and they got sick and they died. So obviously, when we think about preventing relapse and supporting remission and recovery, we want to be able to support people through this very challenging time, particularly this first 5 years. We know these are the major precursors to relapse. Cues, these are people, places, and things, become strongly associated with drug and alcohol use. Stress-induced pathways to relapse, as I mentioned. And then substance-induced, having priming doses of the drug that can kindle craving, elevate craving, increase craving, that can also lead to relapse. So these are the three major pathways. So we want to try and offset these pathways here by providing, what do? We provide treatment, we provide recovery support services. And the mechanisms by which those recovery support services and treatments work is by changing the social infrastructure, the psychology and emotional infrastructure, and also the biology and neurobiology of individuals. So there's all these different levels that are affected: social, psychological, emotional, and neurobiological and biological. So, as you know, there's been a number of some have been around for a long time, but there's been now a cadre of new emerging recovery support services that have grown, become established, and now are being empirically supported, which started really from the grassroots, but now is being shown to be effective and cost-effective, and these are those. And I'm going to go over these in more detail, but some of them are mutual help organizations like 12-step groups like AA, NA, others like Smart Recovery, LifeRing, Women for Sobriety, many others that have started. Peer-based recovery support services. These stem from the mutual help movement. So these are formalized peer coaching, they call them recovery coaches in the States, that are designed to provide peer support as part of a clinical team. Sober living environments, these have been around. Halfway houses, that used to be called. These have been around for a long time, now shown to be effective and cost-effective in randomized trials. Long-term models of clinical care. So I'll show you an example of that. Recovery community centers. These are like senior centers, but they're for recovery in the hearts of affected communities. They provide a beacon of hope for people. They can go in there, they can get support, they can access support meetings, they can get trained how to write a CV, how to put a cover letter together to get a job, which is critical in recovery, to bring in income as well as self-esteem and all these other things. So they link people with criminal records to employers who are willing to be able to take them on. And then we've seen a growth in recovery support services in educational settings, both high schools and in collegiate recovery. So I'll just tell you a little story. You can put your heads on the desk for this one. A man gifts his son some land. A dad gives his son some land on which to build a house. And the son builds a house, and he's very happy. But he looks outside the front door of the house, and he sees this tree, and he notices this tree isn't doing too well. So it makes him unhappy, but he notices over the hill, and in the valley on the other side of the hill, trees are doing really well. So he's scratching his head one day, and what he decides to do, he decides to dig up the tree and go and replant it over the hill where the trees are doing really well. And lo and behold, his tree starts to look really good the way it was meant to. Starts to have the leaves again and starts to bear fruit. So this makes him very happy. So now the tree is doing so well, he digs it up and then replants it back in front of his house. Okay, so he's very happy. But he notices, after a while, the tree begins to look not too good again. It starts to look sick. So, what's the moral of the story here? Okay, pretty clear, I hope. That it's the environment, the soil, that can have an impact on the same organism, the same biology, the same genetic makeup. But if you change the conditions, the nutrition, the sunlight, the photosynthesis in this case, but we're talking psychosynthesis in terms of treatment, but to help organisms through different changes in the environment. And so really what we're doing here is we are trying to create an environment which is supportive and conducive to the growth of organisms. In this case, people who are sick and sickened by chronic exposure to substances. Now, when we think about addiction as a disease of the brain, I think we tend to naturally think of people in white coats and medications, and you got to do something to the brain. You got to operate on the brain, or you got to give someone a medication to get in there, and that does work. It can affect the brain in that way. But what about giving someone a job? Would that change their brain? What about increasing their social network members? Would that change their brain in the same way? What about giving them housing? Would that have an effect on their brain? So this has been looked at because we need to understand, I think, a little bit more clearly what happens when these things go on, because we know they work. So the question is, why? So I told you that we understand now much more clearly the nature of the impact from a neurobiological level about chronic exposure to drugs, alcohol, that it actually reduces these receptor systems. As I mentioned, the D2 receptor, the dopamine receptors, D2, D3, are the receptor systems through those receptors through which we experience pleasure are down-regulated. It's a bit like if the noise is too loud, we put our fingers in our ears because the signal is too loud. And we keep our fingers in our ears until we're sure that the loud noise has gone away. The brain does the same thing. The signal's too loud in addiction. The brain sticks its fingers in its ears. It down-regulates, if you will, dampens down those receptors. And it takes a while for them to be upregulated. So here's a question they asked. Are these D2 receptors, these dopamine receptors through which we experience pleasure, are they correlated in humans, are they correlated with social networks, social support, and social status? Okay, so if you're doing well in your environment and you have a lot of social support. And they found very strong relationships. It's unusual that you find this strength of relationship with these two, a neurobiological biomarker and increased social status. So your social status, and social status usually is defined as your ability to navigate through the environment well, and you can do what you want, pretty much. So you have freedom and autonomy. You can think of that as social status. And social support is you've got people that support you, that you like, and have friends. Again, look at the correlation. Of course, but we don't know from a study like this whether people who have because this wasn't in people who were addicted, but these are just healthy, so-called healthy volunteers. Only 14 of them. This is a difficult study to do because you have to inject a radio tracer and then look at it in the brain in an imaging positron emission tomography scan. So it's a tough study to do, and that's why there hasn't been many in humans. But this is one that shows this relationship pretty clearly and pretty strongly. But as I mentioned, we don't know what came first, right? Which is causal. Did they already have these dopamine T2 receptors, and then that led to them having more social status and more social support? Or did the social support and social status generate those, make those changes in the brain? So here's an example where they actually were able to manipulate that in animals. So they were able to experimentally manipulate to find out, is it causal, or is it causal from the environment to the brain, or is it brain to environment? So what they did in this study was they looked at primates. These were monkeys, and What they found was that they had about 20 monkeys, and they were all individually housed. When they were all individually housed, they measured their dopamine D2 receptor level. What they found was that there was no difference in these monkeys on their dopamine D2 receptor level. When they introduced them into the group, into the troop, so they roughly had groups housing of 4 monkeys each. Monkeys have a natural hierarchy, kind of like humans. They tend to gravitate, one becomes the boss monkey, and the others are subordinate. What they found in the monkeys with higher social status was that their dopamine D2 and D3 receptors went up 22%. There was no change in the subordinate monkeys. How did they define dominance or social status? It was defined as easy access to food and water, social mobility, and greater environmental control. So if you think about that, the environment produced changes in the brains of these primates. So facilitating greater access to and availability of recovery capital in humans may instill hope, empower people, help them have more control over their environment. This is what we try and do. Increase social contact and social mobility through the environment, and thereby induce neurochemical changes that can reduce relapse risk. The other thing I didn't mention is that higher upregulation of D2 receptors in this sample, because they were all exposed to cocaine, they were much less likely to use cocaine if they had these higher levels of dopamine D2. So it's protective against relapse. There's been several other studies also which show high levels of these dopamine D2 receptors, D3 receptors, and a low propensity to use substances. In fact, one study by Nora Volkov, who's the head of NIDA now in the States, she did a study in 1999 where she measured the dopamine D2 receptors and found that people who were injected with stimulants found them aversive if they had high levels of dopamine D2. So it was protective against a euphoric experience of exposure to stimulants. So we think about another way to think about recovery capital and our clinical focus on pathology and the lack of focus on other things other than pathology is highlighted in this example. So if you think about what we generally do in our clinical settings is that we focus so much on the pathology, right, on getting a good treatment history and when did the symptoms start, do they meet the criteria, what levels of those criteria and psychological and psychiatric disturbance do they have. So here's an example, 2 30-year-old men entered treatment with clinically identical levels, so they were matched on their opioid and alcohol severity and psychiatric and medical impairments. And so, because they had identical clinical profiles, they were given the same treatment. Okay, makes sense? So here's the other side of the coin. One of these 2 30-year-old men was from a neighborhood that has a high crime rate and drug and alcohol-related arrests. He didn't graduate high school. He has a father with active alcohol use disorder with whom he lives, and is unemployed with a criminal record. The other man, identical clinically, is from a low-crime neighborhood, is married with 2 children, a supportive family, has a master's degree, employed as an engineer, with a good job and high income. His father has 17 years of sobriety in AA. So how often do we take into account this other context, this other side of the coin in terms of recovery capital and recovery resources that people can draw upon to help instill hope? Is it even worth me trying to do this when the outlook looks so bleak? I didn't graduate, I've got a criminal record, I can't get a job, I can't get a loan. Okay, this is what we're talking about building permits, changing the laws so that we can actually help people get some traction in recovery. So this is just showing the relationship between the reciprocal relationship and how it is mediated by biopsychosocial stress. That remission, if people can stay in remission, their recovery capital can go up. And also, we can influence remission by increasing recovery capital. The more recovery capital this model suggests that people have, the lower the stress level and the more likelihood of continued remission. And really, that's the goal of all of these recovery support services, is that we are trying to decrease stress, increase and accelerate that upregulation of those dopamine D2 and D3 receptors, which looks very likely to happen when we give someone a job, get someone housing, give them some hope, help them get back into college or school, that they can actually feel like they're going to give them social support you're changing their brain. You're actually changing their psychology, but you're also at the neurological level changing, upregulating their neurobiology. So these are some of the, when we think about conceptually what's happening from a psychological, interpersonal level, I like this model. These are concepts by Irvin Yalom, and they come from group therapy theory. Some of you may know these concepts. So the idea of universality, that we have this shared experience that can be very therapeutic. These were therapeutic factors from his group therapy, what he derived from his group therapy. Altruism was, again, a therapeutic factor in his group therapy theory, that if you try and help somebody else, you actually help yourself. Installation of hope, that when people come into group therapy, they see other people getting well, that instills hope. It means that they can see and observe, that gives them hope. Imparting information, just telling people facts, information, that also was a therapeutic factor. Cohesiveness was another very important factor. The idea that we have this thing together and it creates a bond, a common bond with other members of the group. Imitative behavior is another one. There are others too, but these are the main ones. And I think the reason why I point these out is because what we find when we do research and ask people what they get out of engagement in recovery support services, they fall into these categories also. It's the sense of belonging. This is a study that we did. I've replicated this on 4 different samples. This is a 12-step sample with young adults. We asked them, what do you like about, what do you get out of attending 12-step meetings? We've asked this in 4 different cohorts of people, including a family support group. And they're always the same. Always the top 3 in these 4 samples: universality and cohesiveness. This idea of like, what do you get out of it? I feel like there are people just like me there. They've suffered the same thing as I do, as I have. Installation of hope. I feel like I can get better. I see people with 10 or 15 or 20 years in recovery, and I feel like that's what I want. I want to get there, and I know these people have done it. And catharsis is another one. So the idea of being able to ventilate emotionally and be able to verbalize what's going on. So these elements are at play as well, I think, from a psychological, conceptual, theoretical level in all of these different types of recovery support services. The first one I'm going to talk about is mutual help, and we're going to go through these, just give you a little bit about what we've learned from the scientific perspective in each of these areas. The oldest recovery support service has been mutual help groups. And this really, the research in this area has stimulated a lot of other models, one of which I mentioned are these recovery coaches, which are taken off all over the United States and Canada. But it really wasn't until 1990 when the Institute of Medicine called for more rigorous research on Alcoholics Anonymous in particular because of its prominence and its impact in the treatment field as well as in the public health field more broadly. And the last 25 years, with NIH, National Institutes of Health funding, government funding in the United States, there's been dozens now of randomized controlled trials, quasi-experimental studies, cost-effectiveness studies, which we actually are just summarizing now in a systematic review. We're updating a Cochrane review on AA and 12-step treatment, which will be out in a 2 or 3 months, we hope. But and there's all these different styles of 12-step facilitation, so-called. These are therapies designed to link patients with these free, ubiquitous indigenous community resources, i.e. AA groups. What we've found is that 12-step facilitation often produces significantly better outcomes relative to active comparators like cognitive behavioral therapy. And although 12-step facilitation is not AA per se, its beneficial effect is explained by AA involvement in the post-treatment period. So when you do mediational analysis to find out, well, why did this 12-step treatment do better? It's because it links them successfully, gets them involved with groups like AA in the community. Now, when we look under the hood of AA participation, and we ask the question, how does AA confer benefit? What is it about AA then that's actually making the difference, keeping people abstinent over time? This is what we have found. This explains 50% of the effect of AA participation on keeping people sober. Changing their social network, boosting recovery and maintaining recovery motivation, reducing impulsivity and craving, boosting confidence, people's confidence in their ability to cope with negative affect without drinking, and coping with higher risk social situations without drinking. Spirituality is also a factor. How people can reinterpret stress using a spiritual idea and framework. So if you think about it, well, why does 12-step facilitation tend to do better, particularly with sustaining remission? It's because these groups like AA are able to mobilize roughly the same kinds of therapeutic factors and mechanisms that are mobilized by professional treatments, except they do that for free over the long term, around the corner from where people live. So if you think about that, you've got a free, ubiquitous, indigenous community resource that mobilizes the same kinds of therapeutic mechanisms that are mobilized by professional interventions. So to me, it's kind of a no-brainer. It's like if you can get people linked with these free resources, help them create bonds, social bonds with people in these organizations, they're more likely to stay in it, and what we see is that they have higher rates of full sustained remission, and these can be quite dramatic. This is a big study, the biggest study ever done in psychotherapy, called Project Match. It was done in the United States in the 1990s, and they randomly assigned almost 2,000 patients with severe alcohol use disorder to one of three types of outpatient treatment: cognitive behavioral therapy, which was well established, motivational enhancement therapy based on motivational interviewing, and a new one that they tested out called 12-step facilitation. And then they measured their outcomes over the first year and then up through 3 years. What they found was roughly the same outcomes on percent days abstinent and drinks per drinking day. Where there were differences, it tended to favor, much to the surprise of many people, it tended to favor the 12-step facilitation condition. When they looked at continuous abstinence, you can see here the difference between 12-step facilitation and CBT and MET. This is in the first year. This is at 3 years after they were randomized to these treatments. Again, 71% more patients were in remission at 1 year compared to MET, who were in 12-step. 60% more patients were in continuous remission relative to CBT. At 3 years, 50% more patients relative to CBT were completely abstinent who were assigned to 12-step. So a bigger difference in terms of its ability to sustain remission, sustain abstinence across time. The other thing that we found is cost effectiveness. So not only, as you can imagine, these are free, ubiquitous, indigenous community resources, right? They don't cost anything. So if we were to link patients with these free resources in the community, would we enhance outcomes and reduce healthcare costs? That would be good news if we could do that. In fact, that's what they found. This was done in the VA system in the United States, the biggest healthcare system in the world. They have a natural incentive to be able to create efficiencies in healthcare utilization, right? So they want to use everything that they can to reduce healthcare costs and improve outcomes. What they found in this study, when they compared CBT, cognitive behavioral treatment programs, to 12-step programs, they found that 12-step residential programs got people to go to AA and NA more, got more involved, and they used less formal healthcare resources than CBT programs. So in keeping with CBT theory, they prescribed some 12-step, but mostly it was come back and see us and continuing care with the professionals. And what they found was, in terms of clinical outcomes, there was no difference, except once again, those in 12-step were about 1/3 more likely to be continuously abstinent at 1 and 2 years after treatment discharge. But the costs were less, roughly $8,000 per patient who were treated in 12-step. Okay, so they had better outcomes at a lower cost. Just giving everybody 12-step in this treatment, in this sample, saves about $10 to $15 million across 2 years across those 10 treatment programs. Okay, so that's good news. We got a free resource. If we link patients, we can enhance outcomes and reduce healthcare costs. So that kind of data has supported this idea of peer support, formalizing peer support and formalizing peer linkage. And they call this peer support or recovery coaching. It's a buzzword and it's kind of very in vogue in the States. We don't have a lot of data on this yet, but that's going to start to come in the next 10 years in understanding this. We have a lot of data from the 12-step studies, but not so much on this. But what we are finding is that studies that have this peer-to-peer linkage tend to produce greater engagement of patients leaving formal settings, getting them engaged in the community, and those patients do better. Sober living environments, as I mentioned, they've been around for a long time. Halfway houses, you might know them as, but essentially they are usually peer-run, long-term residential communities whereby people live in groups of anywhere from 4 to 8 to 12 people in a house. The Oxford group, the Oxford House, not the Oxford group, but the Oxford House is a model in the United States that has been around for quite a long time. And this has actually been studied by Leonard Jason and colleagues. And they did a randomized trial where they got patients actually to agree to be randomized either to standard outpatient care for 2 years or randomized to a residential setting, okay, where they lived, they go to work and come and go, but they had to live with other people who were in recovery and get a job and so on. And what they found was at the end of this 2-year outcome, the sober living environment had half as many individuals using substances across the 2-year period as regular outpatient, 50% more likely to be employed, and 1/3 as likely to be reincarcerated, because many of them had criminal records. Here's the other thing, saved about $30,000 per year per patient over this 2-year period. So that's, again, a cost-benefit, a cost-effective approach to addressing, not only producing better outcomes, but saving a lot of money. What do we know about clinical models of recovery management and long-term support? One of the very few studies, despite the fact we talk about it as a chronic illness, one of the very few studies that's actually tested this out as treating it like a chronic illness has been done by Michael Dennis and Christy Scott in Chestnut Health Systems in Illinois, and they randomly assigned roughly 500 patients with severe alcohol and drug use disorders to one of 2 4-year follow-up paradigms, okay, kind of like treating addiction like you would treat diabetes or hypertension, so what they call recovery management. And there were two arms to the trial. They randomized patients either to just standard care as usual after some kind of intensive care. So we want you to go to meetings and go to your usual appointments, and we want you to come in every quarter for an assessment. Okay, so they had an assessment on top of that, but there was no feedback based on the assessment. So there was nothing done with the assessment, but they were given an assessment. The other half of the patients got the same thing, standard care, go to meetings, come back, see us. But they had the assessment every quarter, and based on the assessment, they had a half-hour mini motivational interview, just basically saying, if you're doing well, great, how are you doing it? Keep it up, great job. Or if they'd already relapsed, then they tried to link them back into treatment, okay? So those were the two things. They followed them up for 4 years, every quarter they did this. And what did they find? Well, they found it took 3 years. If you were in need of treatment and you were in the usual care without the conversation, if you didn't have the conversation with this linkage manager, it took you 3 years longer to get back into treatment. It was only a 4-year study, okay? 3 years longer. So for people who needed treatment, having that linkage manager who broached the topic, gave them some feedback. This is not rocket science. It's 1 hour of assessment and a conversation with a motivational interview and saying, can I help you get back into some kind of treatment? And they had better outcomes, and it was also shown in another analysis to be cost-effective. Again, a better outcome at a reduced cost. 2 others I'll mention. One is recovery community centers. These are centers which are growing all around the country in the United States and Canada. You can think of these as kind of hubs, community hubs in the center of cities which everybody knows about, that people can go to, get As I mentioned, there's a place you can go. They're not residential, so you don't sleep there. It's not like a halfway house or a residential setting at all. It's just a place where you can go. You can get taught to write a cover letter, a CV, get linked to employers, where you can get a job, get linked to educational opportunities and training opportunities. They have support meetings there. It's a real hive of activity. They're wonderful places, a really positive vibe, and we're doing the first big national study on these right now. I've got a grant to study these, so we'll have the data. Actually, we're just finishing the follow-ups now, so we'll have the data out in the next 6 months. These are happening all over. This is probably triple since we made this map. Growing, as I mentioned, these are the kinds of resources. This is where people come from when they're referred to these. The majority, actually, or a largest portion, are self-referred. What we're finding is that this is another pathway into recovery for many people. Those people have never had any kind of formal treatment. Okay, so they just go to these recovery community centers, and they can access these kinds of resources and recovery support services without going to a formal treatment setting. Not saying that's good or bad, it's just another pathway that people are finding into recovery. And in terms of primary substances, I don't know why that's invisible. I use my invisible ink there, but this is actually opioids, so the biggest proportion of opioids, and then alcohol is the next biggest primary substance, and then you have cases of cocaine, and then other methamphetamine, and so on. But just in terms of who's using them. As I said, we don't have data on that. It's just we just did the first big study, so we'll have data coming out in the next 6 months, but it's looking promising. We have more data, a little bit more data on recovery supports in educational settings. And these are, I think, very exciting because these educational settings are usually where people fall down in high schools, both in high schools and in college settings. And in the United States, there has been a growth in these things called recovery high schools. So after an adolescent leaves a treatment facility that's been treated for a substance use disorder, instead of going back to a regular high school, they go to one of these recovery high schools that's focused on education, but also on supporting recovery, okay? And they've started to be studied. And this is a nice study. We're just doing another study now, proposing to do another study, a big multi-site, multi-state study in the United States to look at this in more detail with a longer follow-up. But what they found in this study, when they compared kids coming out of treatment and going into recovery high schools versus regular high schools, they did much better in terms of they were 4 times more likely to report complete abstinence from alcohol, marijuana, and other drugs, and had significantly lower levels of marijuana use and less school absenteeism. So again, changing the environment, changing the soil can support young people who need really the most support in many ways to destabilize these emerging addiction patterns, get them out of those social networks that are supportive of addiction and continued use. We've also seen this in collegiate settings. So there's been a big growth in collegiate recovery programs. Once again, it's embedding recovery support services in an environment which is typically hostile to recovery in terms of these college settings. Heavy drinking, binge drinking, a lot of that goes on in the United States in these college settings. And several thousand kids die from alcohol overdoses every year just from binge drinking in the United States. So having some kind of recovery support is interesting because it's supporting people, it's giving people a safe haven who want to go back to college, increase their recovery capital, hope for a better future, get an education. It can help them make that transition and get support. What's also very interesting, having gone to many of these conferences, the national conferences, and spoken at them, is that people, when they have these social events, sober social events, it draws people from the broader college community because they don't want people to be drunk around them. So a lot of people who aren't in recovery go to these sober events, and it's actually a draw for them on campus. So it's creating kind of a different culture, a competing culture of health and recovery. So just in summary, I think what we can conclude is that there are biopsychosocial changes which are happening as a function of engagement with these recovery support services. We know that addiction affects the neurobiology of our brain. We know with abstinence there are brain changes, recalibrations, and readaptations to the absence of alcohol and other drugs. But we can, by changing the environment, what it looks like is that we actually can accelerate the upregulation of these adaptive neurotransmitter systems, i.e. dopamine D2 receptors and D3 receptors. And we can also reduce stress by providing more recovery capital. So thank you, Sweden, for ABBA and some great music. And thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity. Like I said, these slides will be available to you. And if you have questions, you can email me through the recoveryanswers.org info website. Then we can answer questions and send you papers.
Okay, thank you, Professor Kelly. We actually have some time for questions from the audience. I'm guessing there are questions. Here comes the first one.
And the question I have to you is, when I heard this about this reduction in dopamine receptors in monkeys, I was thinking, I never asked a question, but if this happens with monkeys, if you have children in an adverse environment, adverse childhood experience, would that lower the dopamine receptors on a child?
If you had worse, sorry.
If you have a lack of attachment or trauma in early childhood.
Yes.
I never heard this answered before.
Yeah. That's also been shown also. Yeah, with trauma and abuse and neglect. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Camilla Svenonius. I'm from Verdandi here in Sweden. I have a question about what you refer to as 12-step program. And you have research on that in the United States, which showed you that it was a cheap model for getting high results. But we have the same discussion here in Sweden since a long time, and we just wonder what about those whose 12-step program doesn't suit. Have you had any studies about the dropouts and see whether the CTB could help them better? No, CBT, yeah, could help them better. Thanks.
Yeah. Now, well, one of the things that we're starting to do now is what we call adaptive treatments. So in general, when you just randomize patients to these 12-step facilitation treatments versus CBT or MET, generally, they're roughly about the same in terms of the continuous measures, but as I mentioned, where you see differences, it tends to favor the 12-step condition, and particularly when you're looking at continuous remission. That's where you see big effects. But, as you're pointing out, many people don't go, even though we're recommending it, right? We're trying to get them involved, but not everybody goes. Only about 50% of people go. But people go in the other groups as well. They just go anyway. But when we're trying to facilitate it, about 50%, 60% go on average. Sometimes higher, sometimes lower. So what do you do with people who don't go? So we're doing these adaptive studies where after a period of 2 or 4 weeks, if there's no response to the intervention, they're re-randomized. So we don't have the answer to your question, but one of the things that we do from a scientific standpoint, but what we do is if, clinically, is if people say, you know what, no, I'm not going to AA, I'm not going to go to NA. So would you go to SMART recovery? So that's a cognitive behavioral mutual help group, like AA, but based on a different philosophy. Same kind of dynamics in terms of the group dynamics, and probably a lot of those group therapy theory concepts, therapeutic mechanisms operating in those groups, I would bet, and producing very similar benefits. So that's what we do. We try and encourage them to try other kinds of groups. And then, if you can offer them different kinds of meetings and groups that are free of charge, then that can help people hopefully find some kind of pathway. And some people just aren't ready to do anything. as we know, are just not ready to make a move and do something like that. But for people who are, but are unwilling to go to 12-step groups, then we recommend other groups and give them a menu of different options like Smart Recovery. LifeRing is another one, a secular organization. Some prefer more religious ones, like Celebrate Recovery is a more religious mutual help group in the United States for people who really want that kind of religious immersion, but it's focused on addiction recovery. We've just gotten a big grant, actually, to study Smart Recovery, the first big real-world effectiveness study, which we're going to start this year in the US. Thanks for that question, yeah. The other thing that's coming on board is the online communities. So there's a lot of online stuff now that people access in all kinds of settings. Reddit, Facebook, communities. There's one big one called intherooms.org. It has about 500,000 people on there 24/7. So people can dip their toe in the water. They don't have to disclose their real name on those things. They can just go on there. They can get support. They can be really honest if they want, because they're not using their real name if they wish. But they also have video meetings and stuff on there. So there's many more now of these online recovery support, mutual help kinds of things out there, which are being studied.
One of the things that I noticed, that I saw the statistics on the first year, and sometimes I don't feel that you get the response from society and others that pays for the treatment, the importance of aftercare and being a part of a support group, even if you don't go to meetings in the 12-step oriented outpatient program or so, is a tendency not to want to have that part as a part of the treatment. So how could we get help to stress that point? That is my question, really. Mm-hmm. And where could those people get all the information that they need to support us? Because I saw the statistics, and it's alarming that you get that drop in quality of life the first year, and how we can support people. Do you understand? It's a question, also a statement. But
yeah. No, I mean, I think you're underscoring. I think what underscored for me how difficult that first year is in particular. We've known this for a long time, how difficult it is to maintain abstinence and remission in that first few months and that first year. Yeah. And this is just kind of looking at it not just from days of abstinence, but of course self-esteem and quality of life and happiness and psychological distress, of course, which probably feed into the actual substance use behavior, because people feel hopeless and stressed out and they don't know what to do. And so I think it just amplifies and re-emphasizes how important it is to support people in that first year. And as we saw, particularly some groups are going to have a really tough time. Right? Yeah. People with opioid addiction, it looks like methamphetamine probably also, just have lower recovery capital, lower quality of life to begin with relative to other groups of primary, again, on average. But in terms of the policy aspects of it, how can we present this to funders, to governments, to states, local authorities? And I think the way that, it depends on your state and government and what they do and what their emphasis is, putting it together, getting that evidence and show it, effectiveness data and cost effectiveness. They're very interested in cost effectiveness data. That's why I love these cost effectiveness studies, because if you can show, wait a minute, we can save money by doing this also and produce better outcomes, hey, I want to give me some more of that. I'll listen to you. Right? Yes. So naturally, we're all interested in things like that, because we have a massive, high volume, high burden, the top public health problem in most middle and high income countries. And yet we're pretty dumb about it in terms of our approaches. So I think finding a way to get that evidence in front of policymakers, I think we're kind of a little bit lucky in the United States in that we have different agencies that request evidence. They're looking for evidence. They just contracted actually with the Recovery Research Institute, the federal government, to do a systematic review of all these recovery support services. So we did a systematic review and presented it, and we're going to Washington, D.C. to have a big panel to find out what do we know, what don't we know, what do we need to know to be able to implement these low-cost, high extensity recovery support services. So anytime you can, kind of get the data together and look for systematic reviews, look for reviews of the data, look for graphs like that which really amplify and highlight, look for cost effectiveness studies. Again, if you can contact us through the Recovery Research Institute, we can help you get that information and present it.
Lovely, and pray for some curiosity and openness from the government.
Exactly. The other thing is revolution and rebellion. Yeah.
Thank you.